Hello everyone, this week we're going to go over the legal foundations and policy connected to English language learners education. We're also going to go over the program models, but we'll start with the legal foundations first. So let's go over our objectives. Hopefully you'll be able to identify key US legislation that affects English language learners and recount the ways in which that legislation influences their rights to bilingual education and also the instructional approaches that are being used in the second language acquisition field. You should be able to link social policy and attitudes with how this legislation has come out and the support it has garnered in the community and in society. And then to link legislation and its relationship to current events that affect ELLs and their rights and freedoms. Okay, so we're covering this topic today because educators who work with English language learners need to understand the history concerning language and education policies and the current legislation that affects the students you'll be teaching. So political decisions affect ELLs are directly connected to social policy and the beliefs and the ideas of those in power, as well as the attitudes and the values of people surrounding immigrants and their heritage languages. So I'm going to try and make that connection for you today between talking about the legislation that has been put into place and also how it related to the events that were occurring at the time, okay, in society, because there's very much a relationship between the two. So there have been laws that have been put into place to suppress the development of languages other than English, but there's also been laws to support the language rights of citizens and immigrants who speak other languages than English. Either way, the fact is that the United States has always been and will continue to be a multilingual and multicultural country. And the 14th Amendment, which we're going to talk about today, provides a constitutional basis for the educational rights of all students. Okay, so it's really important to keep in mind the history of this country, the fact that it is multilingual and multicultural, always has been since the sort of first quote-unquote ship arrived, right, with immigrants. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Founding Fathers never designated an official language. So, and no amendment has ever been made to change that. Okay, so I'm not sure if you knew, but English is not the official language of the United States. There actually is no official language. So even though English is accepted sort of as the mainstream main language of this country, the Founding Fathers did that. They didn't try and impose that as a law in order to respect the linguistic diversity of those who fought for the independence of this country and who established this country, because those people were coming from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Okay, so as a result, the U.S. has continued to face issues with regards to the language and cultural diversity of its inhabitants, and especially in the education of these students, because education is something that is provided for free in the public schools. It's a right. We've determined it as a right for students and for those who are residing in this country. I'm going to talk about the 4 periods of language policy, and we're going to go through each of these in detail. But basically, as I said before, the attitudes and ideas and understandings surrounding other languages have shifted from tolerance of the languages to a focus towards English through various time periods in the U.S. history. So there are 4 distinct periods. The first is the 1700s to 1880s, which was a period of permissiveness towards languages. The period of 1880 up until 1960 was a linguistic isolationist and sort of a period where we saw repressive policies during that period. There was a decline of supportive language policy there was a shift towards equal access, equal benefits, and even heritage language support between the 1960s and 1980s. And then that last period, we're actually in that period, the dismissive period, the 1980s to the present, we see sort of a decline of support towards those language policies that were being set up in that previous opportunistic period. Okay, so let's go over these a little bit more specifically. So we start with the permissive period, which began in the 1700s and ended in the 1880s. And if we think about what's going on around this time in the United States, we know that there were continuous immigration waves during this time period of people coming from all over the world, right, different areas, and it sort of changed with every decade. Also, we know that the slavery was still intact, and the United States was still being formed, especially because the North and the South were separated and opposed to each other, and the country was still having sort of going over its, trying to reinforce its identity, trying to figure out who it was going to be, and trying to separate from Britain. Okay, so we know that there's a lot of changes going on, a lot of immigration waves. Also, for example, parts of the country were still being bought. So New Orleans was a part of the country that was acquired during this time. And this was the time of the Founding Fathers. So again, the Constitution is being written up, and there are many groups of diverse immigrants that are coming together to form this new country. So a major portion of the local population in the United States during the 18th and 19th century were comprised of immigrant groups from Europe, and they spoke a variety of languages, including Italian, German, Dutch, French, Polish, Czech, Irish, and even Welsh. So initially, linguistic diversity was an accepted reality, and the presence of these different languages was supported through their use at religious functions, such as in books and in newspapers, and also in public and private schools. So there was an acceptance and an openness towards these foreign languages, and this was part due to the fact that there was that these immigrant groups would often settle down in a particular area, right? And so that there would be a community or communities of these same background immigrants, and who would be interested in providing their children with education, but also helping them to understand their background and have a connection with that language. Also, if you think about it, the country at this point is not established altogether, and so there's very little communication across the nation where rules can be set in place and sort of monitored by a larger agency such as the federal government. And so every area, every community, every sort of particular city, town would have its own rules towards the ways in which children would be educated. And so there was bilingual education at this point. It was not systematized or sort of founded in a way in which, again, it was being monitored by any governing body above it. And the reason why these bilingual education programs existed in the different pockets around the country was so that it would attract and enroll students, because if the students in that area came from a particular background, they would be willing to provide a particular language or teach religion through that language in order to make the parents and the families in that community happy, right, and to serve their needs. Okay, so we can see that native language and bilingual instruction is pretty commonplace during this time, given the needs of the families in the society and the makeup, sort of the different ethnic makeups of the nation at this point. So let me give you some examples. There were German English schools in German communities in the Midwest. And if you remember when we talked about Pennsylvania Dutch, right, in the Midwest, around Ohio and also Pennsylvania, that was a really big area for German immigrants. And there were private and Catholic schools also providing Spanish, French, and English around the country. Spanish bilingual programs were pretty common in the southwest United States in the 19th century. And there was actually a law in place in 1848 in the territory of New Mexico to offer students education and instruction in a variety of languages, okay, in that area. Okay, so towards the end of the permissive period, we also see the passing of the 14th Amendment. This was a really, really important legislation because it prohibited state and local governments from depriving persons of life, liberty, and property without certain steps being taken to ensure fairness. And I'm sure you have heard about that before: life, liberty, property. That's sort of the three main tenets of that amendment. It also required equal protection under the law to all people within its jurisdiction. So basically, it provided the constitutional basis for the right of all students to be educated, no matter if they were immigrants, if they were born in the United States. Basically, as long as they were physically in the United States, the 14th Amendment would provide them with protection to be educated. This law was a very important precursor to many language-based regulations that were going to come in the future. And many of them were approved or denied in support of heritage language instruction based on this amendment. Again, because the amendment sort of states support and protection and the right to be educated for all students, which include immigrant students or English language learners who are born in the United States. Okay, so let's go to the restrictive period. So what's going on around the 1880s to 1960s in the United States? If we think a little bit more about this time period and the events that were taking place, we know that there was World War I and II. Actually, there were multiple wars. There was the Cold War against Russia, which was actually a very important time period for the United States and its identity. The world wars were fought against Italy, Germany, and Japan, and so those definitely had an influence on the ways in which the American people saw these foreigners and the immigrants of these countries in the United States. We also had the Great Depression, so poverty was something that was experienced during this period. So basically, the most important piece in this restrictive period was the way in which the wars shaped people's outlook and attitude and perception of immigrants. Okay. So the passing... So the first law that we're going to talk about is the passing of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And this was evidence of the nation shifting from sort of a more liberal approach that had been characteristic of the permissive period to a more conservative educational approach and establishing the legality of separate schooling for language minority and for African American communities. Another conservative shift towards the education of language minority students was the implementation of English-only instruction for both public and private primary schools in 34 states in 1923. So, in the case of Meyer versus Nebraska, which took place in 1923, the state of Nebraska attempted to prohibit the teaching of foreign languages in elementary schools, based on the use of a German Bible to teach reading in a private school. So the state had found out that there was a teacher who was using the Bible to teach reading and brought up a case around this. The Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of Meyer, stating that in this particular case, it was overly restricting the liberties of the parents to send their children to a private school where the teacher sort of is free to teach reading using a German Bible. But that was only because this was a private school. But this case is still very important because it sort of shows you the attempt that was made to try and mandate English as the primary language of instruction. And it really showcases the anti-heritage language mindset that was sweeping the nation at the time. And during this time, keep in mind that the prominent method of educating language minority students was the sink or swim approach, or basically undifferentiated instruction. The teacher would not do anything different at all for English language learners in the classroom. Okay, and this is called the sink or swim approach because the student either has the resources and finds a way in which to understand what's going on and thus keep up, or they're going to fail or drop out or sort of a more negative outcome. So the next law that we're going to talk about, well, actually, before I get to the next law, which was the Brown versus Board of Education, another very important law, let me tell you a little bit more about these attempts to try and restrict language during this period. And these attempts are often linked to the concerns of the individuals who spoke these languages. So language repression in history is frequently paired with other forms of discrimination, and they occur during periods of larger debates surrounding social issues, such as immigration. And we'll see how we've seen that connection of immigration and language repression in more current times. Okay, we'll get to that in a moment. So during the restrictive period, the world wars influenced North America to take a politically nativist approach, so a really conservative, defensive approach. And they promoted the acculturation and assimilation of immigrants into one cultural and linguistic mold, right? This sort of developing identity that the United States was coming towards. So in 1954, we have the Brown versus Board of Education law, and this overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson law, which established that separate but equal doctrine, right, where students would be educated separately. They found that law, the Plessy versus Ferguson, was actually unconstitutional for a variety of reasons. One of the main ones being that separate but equal was actually not equal at all, and that these schools could not be equal because the resources that were given to the schools based on the taxes in the areas in which those schools were based were very different. And so schools that were set in poorer communities received less resources, and the likelihood of the poorer communities having residents who were African American or who from a language minority background were much higher. And so it ended up being not equal at all. So this Brown versus Board of Education case established that all students had the right to equal educational opportunities. Similar to the 14th Amendment, the Brown versus Board of Education law stood as a pioneering case in support of students' educational rights. And this law would also come to be used as the foundation for future cases relating to students' heritage language rights. Okay, the last law I want to talk about in this period is the National Defense of Education Act. And this was really interesting because it was in response to the Cold War and the Soviet Union's launching of the Sputnik. Okay, so this act was ratified in 1958, and what it did is that the United States provided some funding on the side for foreign language instruction in elementary schools, high schools, and universities. And the language that they were really pushing was Russian, given that the sort of what was going on with the Cold War and the United States' fear of communism at that time. So, what was really interesting about this fund was that it was only provided for English monolingual students and not for students who came from non-English language backgrounds. So, even if you had a student that spoke Russian, because their family was Russian, they had learned it at home or in some sort of heritage program, which would be unlikely at that point, but they had the language already, this fund was not available for them. The fund had to be used by English monolinguals. And so you can really see the stereotypes that are at work here in society and how they really guided the legislation that came out and the funding that was provided. So although the political climate and need for foreign language instruction aided the creation of sort of a new attitude towards languages in the US in terms of seeing languages as an opportunity to become more global, to become better at war, right? There was sort of that aspect to it. The economic support that was being provided was not to develop the foreign native languages of America's immigrant students, right? It wasn't, we weren't thinking in that perspective of, let's work with what we have, let's try and develop the skills that the American population already comes with, right, already has intact. Again, something that is very similar to the situation that we face today.